Good evening and welcome once again to our second gallery talk. We're very pleased that you're with us again this evening. My name is Artie Ulrichsen and I have been serving on the planning committee for these gallery talks. The purpose of our talks is to continue to commemorate our 150th anniversary, to provide you some history and stories about our past, and to give you another opportunity to visit the 150 exhibits that you see here in the gallery. Tonight, our topic is how transportation has affected the Ames community and the development of the Ames businesses here in town. And I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Jeff Benson. Jeff works for the Department of Transportation, and he's been interested in the history of transportation for many years. He is a Lincoln Highway historian, and he and his wife Margaret have been co-presidents of the Iowa Lincoln Highway Association. And Jeff has previously presented a lecture to our History Association about the Lincoln Highway. So I'm pleased to introduce Jeff.
Thank you. Last Tuesday at the first gallery talk, Margaret Vance gave us a great overview of the history of Ames, and she provided a lot of context for what I plan to talk about tonight. I'm a historian. I'm not a historian, rather I'm a city planner, and so I'm interested in the pattern of Ames and how that pattern came to be. I'm interested in such questions as, why do we have our most heavily traveled street separated from our main street by a railroad track with 60 trains per day? Instead of a highway running down the main street with the railroad track and back, like State Center, Boone, Jefferson, and other towns all across the country. Why is our commercial strip on Lincoln Way and South Duff corridor, and why does it get redeveloped every few decades, even though a lot of it's in the floodplain? Why do we have two downtowns? And why are they so different from each other? And why do we have more commercial centers spread all over the place? And why does it take so long for some of our other commercial centers to fill up? And why are some of them still half vacant? As you can see, my questions are about our retail business areas. And I believe that understanding the history of Ames can answer these questions about the pattern of development in the city and tell us a little bit about what to expect in the future. From a planner's perspective, retail business often happens because of these four main factors: population, rooftops, by that I mean residences, transportation, and other businesses being located there. Somebody has to go first. The history of Ames confirms this, and in Ames, transportation is especially important. Now, Margaret Vance told us that only a few years before the founding of Ames in 1864, there was hardly anyone here, at least anyone with European origins. Consider that a mere 26 years before that, it was illegal for American citizens, natives were not considered citizens, to even enter most of what is now Iowa. Our government told them that the natives that theirs was a sovereign country and we would stay out of it, except for a few cities along the Mississippi River. Of course, there was no way to stop people from coming in. The next 3 decades to see one of the greatest migrations of humans in history up to that point. You would see the development of a transportation technology that made that migration much less difficult, and it would see the founding of many new states, including Iowa. Now, cities had been locating along the Mississippi for the same reasons that cities had been founded along rivers throughout 3,000 years of Western civilization. The rivers provided the major transportation, and the people and products who were traveled overland, got to the rivers where the cities were to switch to river transportation so people and products could go other places. Even as Des Moines and Fort Dodge were being established on the Des Moines River for that same reason, by the 1840s, the Iowa government was telling landowners that they were responsible for maintaining the wagon roads that went past their property. 1840s. Sometimes these were established stagecoach or wagon routes, and sometimes these were section line roads laid out on the grid that was being laid over the land by surveyors. So this brings us back to Ames and my first question. Why do we have most of our most heavily traveled streets separated from our main street by a railroad track with 60 trains per day instead of the highway running down Main Street with a railroad at the back? Not being an historian, I have not researched when the wagon tracks we now call Lincoln Way were first came into being. But I do know that that road is on the section line, and it was here very early. You know, it came to be known as the Boone Road, so I assume it went from Nevada to Boone. And it didn't go by a straight route all the way. By the time John Blair and a few other railroad builders first came to this area in 1863, Isaac Black owned quite a bit of land bought cheaply from the county, from north of this wagon track, we now call Lincoln Way, to south of it all the way to the Squaw Creek in some areas, and east to the Skunk River. Now, much of this land was swampy, full of marshes and ponds, and unusable. So Cynthia Duff bought land from Isaac Black and then sold it to John Blair. That was north of the section line Boone Road. And then Blair and his engineer laid out the railroad and the first plat north of it, and boom, 150 years of waiting for trains at every north-south street in town. Cynthia, why didn't you buy John Blair that land on the south side of the railroad tracks? Is my anguish cry every time I have to wait for a train at the South Duff Crossing. And I've been doing that for about 55 years. Well, when I get calmed down after the train passes, I remember that John Blair was there to build a railroad. And he and his guys were checking out locations for road beds and bridges. Now, the further south, the land was closer to the confluence of the Skunk and the Squaw, and therefore in the flood zone, and had more marshes. The further north, the land on the east side of the rivers was higher, the banks were higher and steeper. And railroads don't like steep grades, and the higher the banks, the more expensive the bridge. So probably the locations where that railroad crosses the Skunk River and the Squaw Creek were the best locations for bridges. They had right where they had to be. The land on the north side of the tracks was higher and drier than the land on the south side of the tracks. And the road we now call Lincoln Way, it was 2 wagon tracks and in the mud, and who cared? Mr. Blair probably didn't even notice it. So now let's talk about that Platte that shaped our downtown north of the tracks. Established as a railroad stop and developed by land speculators with that in mind, the original Platte of Ames is an uninspired design showing limited scope and little foresight. The plan is a mixed design which respected railroad interests and paid little regard to the community's future welfare. That's a quote from Will Page in his study of Ames from 1992. He went on to say, the original town plan encouraged traffic congestion and uneven development in the central business district, while it discouraged a sense of place for the community. Had the town's designers strictly adhered to a gridiron plan, square grid plan, later confusion could have been avoided. The original town plat lacked any public open space, and no public lands were given over to community use. There was no public square, as in most towns founded with local government purposes in mind. The plat also encouraged no vistas, where a terminus could provide a sense of place for the community. The original town also lacked a focus or a natural center of the development for the development of business and community concerns like a courthouse building. Now it warms a planner's heart to hear that, a Platte with bad planning was important to the future of the community. So let's talk about the downtown. That's the Platte he was talking about. You can see the proximity of the street to the railroad, how the lots got really small down here, made it very difficult to develop, the lack of a square. Banshell was created much later. Of course, by 1865, the railroad was built, as well as a passenger depot at the east end of Onondaga Street, where the railroad crossed Duff, near that, but south of the tracks. That's the passenger depot and the freight depot in Duff Avenue and the tracks. It is thought that groceries and a few other necessities were sold at the depot at first, so this is also our first business. It is obvious that transportation was the reason for this location, but none of the other conditions I mentioned at the beginning existed. Hardly any other people were here. There's only one rooftop on Main Street, and only a few others scattered around, and no other businesses. So is my analysis wrong already? Well, this was an extraordinary time. Massive migration, towns popping up on rivers and wherever the railroad went. The people that started the businesses here were confident that this was going to be a town. In 1866, there were 100 people here. By 1869, when George Tilden arrived here, the railroad across the country already connected all the way across, linking the east and west coast. Classes had begun at Iowa Agricultural College, and the population had increased by 500%. The 100 block of Onondaga was the commercial center of town in 4 years. And by 1875, when Parley Sheldon arrived to farm south of Ames, there was a thriving business district with population, rooftops, and other businesses. I believe the first commercial building was on the corner of the northwest corner of Duff and Onondaga, but shortly after, S.O. Osborne's drugstore showed up on the northwest corner of Onondaga and Douglas. In 1866, Miller's hardware store on the northeast corner of Onondaga and Douglas. By the late 1860s, this 100 block of Onondaga was, on the north side, was the preferred location by merchants, and it was the commercial center of Ames. Even though you had to put in several feet of fill to build buildings there because of the wetness. 1870, Osborne Drug was built at the northeast corner of Douglas and Onondaga. It was built on piles due to wet conditions. And the original Opera House was in this block. This image you see up there is a later image after brick buildings started getting built. On the south side, closer to the railroad, the businesses needing shipment of heavy goods located, such as Lodds, Monroe, and Soper livestock traders, and also warehouses for the hardware store, which William O. Boyd had taken over from Miller in 1877. Also, in those early days, you needed hotels near where travelers were coming off the depot. And the Sherwood Hotel was on the corner of 5th and Douglas. That's right here where we're sitting right now. And that, I don't know if that's the Sherwood Hotel, but that's a hotel, a wood frame, that was there by 1907. 1868, the West House Hotel was built. In the late 1860s, the New York House was there on the northwest corner of Duff and Main. And the east end of Main Street developed for livery, feed, and stable across Duff. By 1898, the Loughran Machine Company, which later became Munn Lumber. Now, most of this development was in wood frame buildings, and several fires in the 1880s really changed things. Brick buildings were built. But the commercial center of Ames was shifting down Onondaga to the west. The population was growing, more rooftops were added. The railroad was the transportation that connected Ames to the rest of the country, but transportation within Ames was horse, wagon, and on foot. Therefore, business needs were met mostly in one central location, and living, working, and worshiping near that central location was much preferred. Beautiful large homes were built on Duff and Douglas, some of the corridors that provided easy access to the center. But another advance in transportation was shifting the pattern. Earlier during this Ames 150 celebration, Doug Biggs told the fascinating story of the Ames and College Railroad and how it affected the growth of Ames and the connection of the two parts of Ames. This fast-growing town and the college, in its splendid isolation on the hill on the other side of the squaw and the swamp. Let's talk about what was happening in the Fourth Ward at that time. Now, in 1859, when the state bought the 640 acres that became the college, it was prairie, in need of drainage to be productive, with trees only in the stream valleys. One of those streams we now call College Creek, and it fed swamps and ponds along the south side of the campus, making it difficult to travel across the College Creek and southwest of campus. In 1868, just before classes started at the college, there were only 3 buildings there and nothing nearby except a few scattered houses. With travel to Ames often a real chore, everyday needs of students and staff had to be provided for on the college grounds. There was a wood plank bridge in 1874 across the Squaw Creek, near where 6th Street crosses now. But not everyone expected this condition to continue for long. In 1876, President Ananiah Welch and his wife bought land south of the Boone Road and east of what is now Welch, and platted 3 lots. They didn't do that for fun. They did that because they expected to sell and make money. The next year, Professor J.L. Budd and other faculty bought land west of the college land, dividing it into 10 building lots and some larger parcels that provided flexibility for future development. What I've shown here is later when land actually started getting developed, and the different shadings talk about different decades, and nothing was platted on this plat before 1900, and then they started before 1890, then it started 1890 on. So the development in the area off of campus really didn't get going until the turn of the century. More students came, the college grew, more buildings were built on campus. In 1892, the Fourth Ward was annexed and became part of Ames. In 1897, the Marston Water Tower was built, which allowed for the growth of the college, as well as some properties outside of the college campus, limited growth. And the Ames College and College Railroad made it possible for people to live in the Fourth Ward, not students, they weren't allowed to live off campus, and go downtown for their needs. So we've heard that the 1890s was a period of growth and progress in Ames, unlike many parts of the country. Growth in the student population, 300% in the 1890s, and fires at Old Main on campus brought a lot of change to the Fourth Ward. The emergence of the business of providing private student housing, the growth of the Greek system, and the eventual emergence of the business district south of the college. But I think there's a fascinating story with historical significance about the simultaneous emergence of a business district on the west side of campus. Transportation was also an important factor in development of that area. So this is Ames and the railroad and the college. And there are some this is 1899, there are some old roads here. This is Westgate, what we know as West Street now, and Woodland. was an old stage road or wagon road that went out, and there's also what we now know as Sheldon went up and over to Ontario. So there were already some old roads on the west side of campus that provided transportation. Also, Olson had a thriving greenhouse business there by 1900, wholesale, as you know, selling flowers all over the Midwest. And by 1905, there were 15 residential buildings facing the college on what was then called Pike Street, now called Sheldon. And there were more on Highland, 1 block west. There were 12 student clubs housed in the Westgate area. Student clubs were group residences. Before 1900, student life on campus centered on the high ground in the center part of campus around Old Main and Margaret Hall. So this is in 1905, but before 1900, most of the buildings were right here, and Westgate's over here. It was a short walk, and it was on high ground. You didn't have to cross the swamps and the College Creek to the south. So that was a very active area at the turn of the century. And then in 1900, the dormitory portion of Old Main burned. The Iowa State College trustees approved rules allowing a limited number of students to live off campus beyond the clubs and fraternities that had been previously allowed. And thus began the business of student housing in Ames. In 1907, the electric-powered Ames and College Railroad began service between downtown College campus and Westgate. And these are some photos of that. This old map shows the route, the tracks extended to the west side. Here's a depot, if you want to call it that, 1913. 1916, the Olson greenhouse had a little depot built there. And this is a later photograph showing a much nicer depot over by what is now State Gym. In 1908, the expansion of the college sewer plant accommodated growing use of property west of campus after the fires, and change in policies allowed growth in student numbers allowed housing over there. This is one of my favorite pictures. This shows how the west side of campus became kind of the center of student life for a few years there. This is Briley's Pond. It was dug where they took out clay to make bricks, and standing essentially, I think Margaret and I figured this out, on Highland, looking downhill to the northwest towards Oakland across what's now Campus Avenue, and this house is still there on Oakland Street down at the bottom. This is a tug of war that took place every year on the college campus. And you can see from this Sanborn map that there were a number of residences already on Sheldon in 1911. So commercial business began emerging here at the same time. Sometime before 1915, S.V. Whitaker operated the Athletic Drug Company. In 1918, he built a new cement building at 2814 West Street to cater to student trade. And Dr. Swaddock later operated this drugstore and lived on the second floor, and it became a gathering place for students. This, of course, is still there, and you can see the Athletic Drug Company sign at the top. Other businesses came too. There, 1912, the Cameron Company Confectionery and Smoke Shop. You get your candy and your tobacco in the same place on Highland. Before 1914, Briley's Grocery was on Pike Street. This is the delivery vehicle getting stuck over on the Boone Road by what's now Richardson Court, I believe. Before 1917, there was a place called the Annex, dry cleaning, steam cleaning, clothing repair. In 1917, Dr. G.F. Puffett at 2903 West Street, which would be across the street from the West Street Grocery, which later became Dugan's Deli and Mother's Pub. That building wasn't built and operated until the 1920s, so I haven't really gone into that. 1917, Frank's Place sold groceries, fruit, veggies, bakery, candies, cigars, tobacco at 2840 West Street, which is west of the building that's now Thumbs, west of that building, where there's an apartment building now. And by 1917, there was the college garage, which was on, at that time it was called North Lincoln Way, later became Gilbert's Garage. So growth in Ames, population generally, both student and non-student, and particularly the increase in rooftops on the west side of the college in the first decade of the 1900s contributed to the development of business here in the second decade. And I love this picture. It's looking west across campus, and you can see rooftops west and south of campus, but open country just beyond. So you had housing and rooftops developing there, but the rest was countryside. It had transportation access provided by old wagon roads and convenience for walking. S.V. Whitaker and J.F. Dixon established the early retail businesses, providing basic necessities, and other businesses followed. The expansion of local railroad service spurred this growth. But transportation between this area and the area south of campus was a challenge here and here because of College Creek. Even after this bridge was put in 1910, the newspaper stated that a deep cut between Highland and Welch here made a road here almost impossible. In 1915, the school board gave the city 30 feet of land on the edge of the Welch School property, which would have been, Welch School was there, gave the city 30 feet of land, and in that year voters approved a Sheldon Extension, which went all the way down to Knapp Street and began to connect things together. So transportation and the growth of the college and the town allowed Westgate to develop in the first 15 years of the 20th century into a mixed-use district that provided a variety of housing, staple goods, and merchandise, basic services, and entertainment. As we know, the area south of campus was also growing to provide those needs, and it quickly eclipsed Westgate. Although the area south of the Iowa State College had some houses, starting in 1904, things really began to pick up. That's when A.L. Champlin came to town, or to the farm south of town. By the following year, he had a grocery store on the southeast corner of Welch and Boone Street, amidst a few commercial buildings here. In 1907, after buying the Ames and College Railroad, the Fort Dodge Des Moines and Southern built the line crossing Boone Road at what is now Lynn, that used to be called Swamp Street, and curving south between Welch and Stanton. This helped the subdivision in that area become streetcar suburbs. Imagine that. Ames had suburbs. And you can see that line, 1909, crossing. So Lynn Avenue is right about here. This is looking west on the Boone Road. And this building at the top of the hill is about where the First National Bank used to sit till last summer. Does this look like a good place to invest? But look at the example Iowa State is showing of the shining city on the hill, made possible by the rational approach in science and technology. There were 20 student residence clubs in South Campus area in 1905 and a few businesses. In 1906, T.H. McDonald became the first permanent city engineer and ushered a new era in development of public utilities. I want to know if this is the same Thomas H. McDonald, student of Anson Marston, who was the first chief highway engineer for the state, and later became the first chief highway engineer for the feds, and essentially built our modern highway system. Yes. Well, this is quite a guy if he can, in his spare time, become city engineer for the city of Ames, the first permanently paid city engineer, and build a water system. In 1907, the college completed Alumni Hall, as a center for social activity closer to the South Campus area than previous buildings had been. So in 1909, Champlin built the brick building on the southeast corner. And by 1914, it included groceries, meats, bakery goods, soda fountain, drugs, fountain pens, dry goods, notions, a tea room with fresh milk and eggs from the farm every day. And that then became the student gathering place. I love this picture of the excavation of the basement for this building. And Alex tells me that's A.L. Champlin right there. There was a Champlin taxi service out of the livery stable to the east, over here. In 1914, the Twin Owl Junior Cafe was established. In 1915, Wiley's lunchroom was on Boone Street, just a block to the west. 1916, Edwards Coal and Ice was to the east, near Lynn, catering to clubs and fraternities. And before 1916, Burton and Myers had the Annex Taylors and the Annex Pantorium near Champlin's. Now, Charles Baretta was a barber on campus. By 1914, he had moved into the smaller two-story brick building east of the Champlin building. And then in 1916, he built this building, two-story brick building, on the southwest corner of Welch and Boone for the barber shop with 2 apartments above. But before he could move in, he rented it to the Orient Ice Cream Parlor. And in 1916, the Little Brothers, who had been real estate developers, Little Street, built a 2-story building west of the Baretta corner building here, and Baretta rented that, one of those spaces, for his barbershop. 1916, Jamesons, popular downtown store for men, opened a college men's store. And in 1916, Reynolds and Iverson, another downtown business owner, opened student supply store. So by this time, the downtown business people had recognized the value of Campus Town as a place for business. In 1915, the Iowa State College completed a dorm annex at 2131 Boone Street. So that's across from campus to the south, probably about where Buchanan Hall, somewhere in that area. In 1916, C.J. Lentz opened the College Savings Bank at Hayward. It had other commercial space into which Burton and Myers moved their store, now calling it the Annex Haberdashers. And note the campus toggery, you can't really read that, but Toggery, which had just opened with men's clothing, tailoring, and cleaning. And this is a later picture of the bank, and I wonder if that building is still underneath all that metal that's there. Margaret Vance talked about the growing resentment about the lack of city investment in public infrastructure in the Fourth Ward, such as sanitary sewer, and the disease scare that led to the 1916 movement to secede, which Mayor Parley Sheldon helped to avert. Gloria Betcher has presented findings from the ISU archive that indicate Iowa State College and business interests such as Champlin made an agreement that commercial development would not expand east of Lynn or west of Hayward, and in return, Iowa State College would beautify the south edge of campus as its main entry and include building Lake Laverne, thereby eliminating the swamps. So investment was made, and here this picture from 1916, looking south from the north side of Lake Laverne. That was under construction, and that was what was there on the south side. Investments were made by both the city and the Iowa State College, and the South Campus area became the more attractive business location than the Westgate area. And so in 1923, the Ames Zoning Commission was established. A.L. Champlin was one of its first members. In 1930, the Ames Planning Commission was established. And in 1931, the first zoning ordinance was established, and the zoning map, this zoning map, took effect. So here you have the South Campus area with commercial and light industrial. And you also got that here, which is the Olson greenhouse area. And then you got a tiny little bit of C district, local business, where Westgate was, and there's no other such area anywhere in town. You know what? We still have a special zoning designation for those 3 or 4 commercial buildings at that location. The population growth around the turn of the 20th century stimulated residential growth in both areas and south of the college campus, and rooftops increased in both areas. Expansion of activity areas to the south part of campus helped make foot traffic more convenient for the south area. Other transportation improvements, such as the expansion of the railroad, the crossings of College Creek, and expansion and improvements of the road system, helped the area south of campus grow. Not only were there a few early entrepreneurs that attracted others, but one, A.L. Champlin, was an effective and aggressive developer and promoter of the district. Within 10 years, the base was established for the special pattern of our town today. But at the same time, a transportation revolution was underway, the automobile, and it was to transform the pattern of business in Ames and every other city in the country. And this is a shot of an early shot taken near Ames. And this shows the explosive growth of automobile registrations in Iowa. And this is a 15-year period where it went up to 500,000 vehicles. This new technology provided new opportunities for business. The first gas station in the country is not known where it was, but it might have been in New York City or Boston. It was typically an elevated tank and hose at the curb like in Dallas in 1903. I don't know if there was a filling station like this anywhere in Ames. Don't think so. This is one. That one's in Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, the good roads movement started before the growth of the automobile, but because of its growth, it really took off. One of the results was the proliferation of named highways, promoted to attract growth and to stimulate road improvements. In 1911, the American Association for Highway Improvement began pushing for federal funding to states to improve roads. But in 1912, Carl Fisher started another approach to highway improvement. He was already a well-known promoter because he had developed the Indianapolis Speedway. The next project was to begin to gather support for a coast-to-coast rock highway. The Lincoln Highway was to become one of the most successful and well-known examples of the named road, named highway. Other early supporters were Frank Seiberling, who ran Goodyear Tire, Henry B. Joy, who ran the Packard Company, who was a fan of Lincoln's and said, "Let the good roads be built in the name of Lincoln." It was his idea, reportedly, to make the highway, besides being a better name than the coast-to-coast rock highway, become the Lincoln Highway as a memorial to Lincoln. They believed that the so-called modern highways were essential for commerce and the growth of America. Successful highways, of course, would help their businesses. They believed such a highway could be privately funded. The route was established by trying to determine the most direct route from New York to San Francisco, and of course, cities along the way wanted to be located. The Lincoln Highway Association was formed late in 1912, and then it announced that in the summer of 1913 it was going to establish the route. So there was a frenzy of people wanting to get their town on the route, and that was pure free publicity for the entire operation. And they kept it secret until they announced it. Now, Ames and other interests along the Transcontinental Highway, which was what was here at the time, were successful in getting the route to follow the roads that passed through Clinton, Cedar Rapids, Ames, Carroll, Council Bluffs, instead of the other highways that went through Davenport and Des Moines. One of the reasons it follows that route through Ames is because of the bridges across the Squaw and the Skunk that already existed. And notice how, this is 1908, but notice how this road does not go through. And so, of course, it had to go through Ontario. That's the Lincoln Highway route through Ames. And this is one of the bridges across the Squaw, the Luton Arch Bridge, built in 1908 for $8,000, despite the advice of engineering professors at Iowa State College. Their recommendation for design would have cost $3,000 more. So the county built their version. After it was completed, the professors measured it and advised that it would collapse after a few years of service if subjected to unusual stress. 10 years later, in the flood of 1918, it collapsed. Since the route was simply announced, it was existing roads. They didn't build anything at first. They just drove and mapped, connected existing roads. So to follow it was to find a path through the landscape of America. The travelers had to follow many turns to stay on the route. So guidebooks were published that described the route, the conditions, and the accommodations along the way. And you could buy ads for your business in the guidebook. The guidebook would have control points established at recognizable places in the town, and then the mileage between the control places. So they could say, go 3 miles to this spot and turn right. The control point in Ames was the Sheldon Hotel, which Parley Sheldon and A.L. Munn had built in 1916, I believe. Sheldon was involved in the Good Roads movement since the turn of the century. And he was an officer in the United States Good Road Association. In fact, he brought its national meeting to Ames in 1928. He was an officer in the Jefferson and Wilson Highways Association, which he got both to go through Ames. The Jefferson Highway connected the city in Canada, Ontario, Winnipeg, was it? To New Orleans, called the Pines to Palms Highway. And it came down to Colo, and then turned west and went down the Lincoln Highway to Duff, and then went south. The Wilson became Highway 69. So it came down what later became Grand to Lincoln Highway, turned east, and went down to Duff. So Parley, he knew that these named highways, with their guidebooks, with traveler information and ads, would bring traffic through Ames and promote business. Like many communities, Ames changed the name of Boone Road to the Lincoln Way in 1914. And several businesses in Campus Town changed their name, too, to like the Lincoln Cafe and Lincoln Clothiers and things like that. That happened across the country as well. This shows the dates of Platte's downtown along Lincoln Way between the Squaw Creek and the city limits. And what this basically shows that by the time the Lincoln Highway was established in 1913, this entire road had been developed with houses. It was all residences along both sides of this highway. By 1916, the segment was paved, and other businesses began to show up. The Ames Daily Tribune headline in April 26, 1924, Ames will have 10 gas stations soon. 4 are now under construction, will open shortly. So that 1925 map below shows 8 of them on the Lincoln Highway by 1925. The other need, of course, was roadside accommodations. This was the first roadside accommodation, is camping in your car along the side of the road. And towns like Ames established campgrounds. Ours was Maxwell Park, which later became the Ames Cemetery. You could go camping there. But it evolved very quickly. First to having little cabins, and cities began to realize that the private sector could take care of this. So you had cabins, and you had cabins that were grouped into courts, and then you had cabins that were connected into motels. And all of these things were seen in Ames. There's been some great research done to show how Ames had a microcosm of the development of modern highway lodging. And I love this beautiful Ames tourist court developed, this is 1925, developed by J.W. Ogle. Garage doors furnished cabins, room for car inside. You can have your car, right? Well, if it's raining and you're camping beside the road, everything gets wet. You have a cabin with a garage, you just pull in and everything's dry. This is still here, sort of. All the studs are there and the foundation. Everything else has been changed. Across the street and down a little ways, later was developed the Conoco Motel, which also had garage doors. This is still here. Some of it's been burned. This is still here. It's got the porch been removed. This was developed by the Bourne family, and they had a little enclave of roadside businesses there. This is a Canopy gas station that's across the street where that little restaurant is now. And the Well of Bourne had a restaurant called the Well's Kitchen next door to that across the street. So they got grouped. By 1934, this shows businesses developed every 10 years. So in 10 years before 1934, we had a lot more service-type stations. So this phenomenon of a new type of business was being developed. There's Bourne's service. There's the Ames Tourist Court, Duff Avenue, other gas stations. Falls Service Station was a good example of combining services in one building, where they eventually had service, gas, restaurant, all in one building. And of course, if you've been over to Colo and see the Reed Nylon Corner, it's an outstanding example of the early one-stop where you could get everything, and it's been restored faithfully to the period of significance. And it's still open, or is open again as Nylon's Cafe. But there was vehicle service downtown by 1929. There were 4 service stations, including one at 5th and Burnett, owned by Yates. There was a Chevy garage at 203 5th Street, Allen Motor Company, and at 423 Main, the Shell filling station. But Lincoln Way businesses accommodated auto access. They were, big enough lots that you could build a building that had parking and room to get in, get out. You didn't have that on Main Street. And so that evolved to the auto-oriented business. The Lincoln Highway was also in Campus Town. I don't think it really contributed to the Campus Town business development so much because they had the college. But there were new services offered. There was a gas station at the corner of Highland and Lincoln Way in the 20s. Pike Street, which was on the west side of campus, remember, its name was changed to North Lincoln Way, North Lincoln Street. And it had businesses that catered to travelers. This is Steele's, Margaret? Steele's Cafe on what's now called Sheldon. Briley's Grocery was still there. The Lincoln Highway west of the Squaw Creek was paved in 1921. It had been paved downtown in 1916. It was paved west of the Squaw Creek in 1921. And then in 1929, it was paved west of the intersection of the Lincoln Highway. And by that time, it was already numbered US Highway 30. And, paving, this is a picture in the same area we saw that mud and the railroad crossing before. And this just shows the improvements that were made by the drainage system and by the paving of roads, looking east at the corner of Lynn and Lincoln Way. And I love this picture from 1937, looking northeast across Lincoln Way and Grand, when the Grand Avenue underpass was being built. You've got the depot and the railroad and the Des Moines and Southern Railroad and the depot for that. Plus you've got the gas stations here and here, and then the DOT, the Highway Commission headquarters, all there in one place. Imagine the foresight of city council members to build an underpass under the tracks on Grand Avenue, and how terrible our lives would be without that today. So businesses replaced those houses slowly on Lincoln Way. This is a shot from the 40s looking west. And you can see the field house for the high school here, Grand and Lincoln Way. You can see a few houses scattered around, but you've got businesses. You got all these storage tanks for oil and gas and everything. So it really shows the transformation that the Lincoln Highway brought to Lincoln Way from a residential to a commercial street. 1940s, there were bigger, truck service and some grocery stores and other things like that, becoming a more of a place for business than just more business than just cars. And then this is the strip, of course, of Lincoln Way when we begin to see the transformation of auto-oriented commercial business from local ownership to national franchises and companies that was soon to take over. 75 businesses were created along Lincoln Way between Grand and Duff between 1913 and 1958. And today there are, I think, 2 residential houses left, one of which is the Martin House, which is a local historic landmark and may not be demolished without city council approval. Ames had a lot of population growth in those years and rooftops, but it wasn't so much those rooftops around Lincoln Way that caused this development. Early businesses catered to the automobiles and travelers, but the convenience of the type of site you could create on Lincoln Way brought a lot of other business types in. And other than Campus Town and downtown, retail businesses didn't expand hardly anywhere else in Ames during those 4 or 5 decades of commercial strip development. Of course, we did have expansion of the commercial strip down Duff Avenue. That was the next movement because highway-oriented commercial was so successful. The 1936 image above from the Squaw Creek North surrounding area appears much as it did when it was classed as an unusable swamp in about 60 years earlier. In the 1960s, there was a 43.6 population growth. And although the highways that stimulated our commercial corridors have now been replaced with bypasses, US 30 in 1968, I-35 later, other than motels, service stations, and restaurant, the bypasses have not really created new commercial corridors. The US 30 bypass attracted development to go south towards US 30, but on the South Duff corridor. And the growth of Ames population to 50,000 and beyond attracted a lot of redevelopment of Duff Avenue because that is a benchmark that commercial retailer locators look at in locating commercial highway businesses along with traffic counts. And the word is for retailers around the country that if you come to Ames, you want to be on Duff Avenue. So I propose we change the name of South 16th Street to Duff Street, and then we can have more places for business to be located. So that is why we've had redevelopment of sites, even in the floodplain, because that's where retail business wants to be, and they can still make money even if they get flooded out. And they always build on the fill so that they have less chance of the new building getting flooded than the previous building. Now, the phenomenon of department stores, there were local department stores at the after World War II, but they were on Main Street, and the modern department store expanded on Main Street to include JCPenney, Yonkers, Montgomery Ward, Sears by the 1960s. But population growth in Ames and in the region, as well as the increase in cars, outstripped the available space and the parking downtown. The phenomenon of the enclosed shopping mall, essentially an indoor Main Street, anchored by department stores and surrounded by parking, had been growing for 20 years when it came to Ames in 1970. You can see this area was not surrounded originally by rooftops, but they were coming soon. And the fact it was on US Highway 69, where the traffic was growing and growing and growing, made it an ideal site for a regional retail center. The retailers selling groceries and other things were already here, and they showed that it was a viable commercial site. In the 1990s and 2000s, new commercial centers, neither corridor nor mall, have been established in the Somerset, Bloomington Road area and the Mortenson, South Dakota area. This is 24th Street, G.W. Carver, Bloomington Road, Stang, Somerset, the Fairway. This Somerset Bloomington Road commercial node started in Somerset at Stang and Northridge Parkway. And its pattern was similar to the downtown and campus town, a mix of housing types with ground floor retail at its center. But the commercial center was slow to get started. The first businesses were a credit union, the architects who were involved in the project development, and several personal services. Although rooftops were expanding to the west and the south, the rooftops close by lagged at first. So there's a lot of empty land around this commercial area. However, a survey conducted in the early 2000s of people who owned homes in Somerset revealed that the people were getting exactly what they were looking for, which was a walkable community with services close at hand. The commercial development got a boost when Bob Cummings opened the cafe. He's a well-known local restaurateur who, with a partner, had already established two other well-liked, well-known restaurants. And this attracted attention and customers. Businesses and personal services grew in the area, as well as rooftops and populations as the developers invested in buildings. The developers also began pushing for other commercial area nearby with larger sites with better vehicle access. Now and that's where the Fairway and the Casey's came along. Now there are a half dozen restaurants, a grocery store, convenience store, and many services surrounded by rooftops. Streets have been improved and expanded. This north area is going to continue to expand. Will we need more commercial space up there? West Town is what we refer to as the area down by Mortenson and South Dakota. This is the other commercial node in the southwest part of Ames that has also taken time to grow. The interchange was built and roads were improved. Mortenson, South Dakota. Population of the community and the university has grown a lot since its development began. I mean, Ames grew a lot between 2000 and 2010, quite substantially. Rooftops grew up to a point, and much of it in apartments that cater to students. Early investors created space for business on the ground floor of those apartments, and a convenience store and a retail space on the southwest corner was created right here. Brian and Kevin Kinnear opened the Westtown Pub, and then they also built the Perfect Games. So they were kind of the early local investors who got actual businesses going there, early retailers. And the other early businesses included a coffee shop, a hotel, and personal services. But there's been persistently vacant land as well. This land here, we have one basketball facility, another basketball facility. Now we're getting a hotel built here. The lack of available land for residential development out there has prevented those rooftops from expanding like was anticipated to the west and south. And that really reduces the interest of potential retailers when they don't see population close at hand. And the other thing is, we talked about traffic counts and vehicle-oriented. There are thousands of people living within a half mile of this node, but most of them live in apartments, and they travel by bus to campus. And that just doesn't show up on the retail radar screen often enough. Urban retailers are used to the fact that they're looking at people who walk and people who ride mass transit. But typical suburban retailers, are looking at traffic counts. But that's changing, and a pattern in businesses in Ames is well positioned to take advantage of those changes in transportation, demographics, and lifestyles. Ownership and use of automobiles are declining nationwide. Many younger people, the people who will be establishing households in the future, are interested in walkable neighborhoods and commercial areas close at hand. They will use mass transit if it's offered. Ames has walkable neighborhoods surrounding 5 different commercial centers, all of which are either thriving or emerging, not declining. This is an available resource, an invaluable resource for a small city such as ours. Certainly, both auto transportation and mass transit offer huge challenges for the future. But if we're willing to meet those challenges, we can continue to expand while keeping Ames a very special and desirable place to live. Thank you. Have time for questions?
Take some questions, just a couple minutes.
You have any questions? Yes.
What would you say are the major reasons why this area south of campus developed as opposed to the west side of campus? Was it got rid of the swamps? Or?
Yeah, I think transportation had a lot to do with it. We had that railroad coming down through there. Also, the road construction and draining of the swamps, et cetera. A lot of the activity on the campus began to shift towards the south. The Memorial Union was built in the 20s, right across the street from Campus Town. Dormitories, huge dormitories were built there. So my theory is every major change you see in Campus Town is associated with a change on the Iowa State campus. There's just a huge connection between that kind of a district and what a university like Iowa State does. And that was true back in 1900 when they began to allow students to live off campus, and it's true today. So I think a lot of the things had to do with that. And A.L. Champlin, when you have somebody who is an aggressive and successful marketer and developer, you get things happening. And so I think those are the reasons why it took off. Other questions? Yes?
Jeff, why did Lincoln Highway, it seems like it went down Highland and then across Ontario instead of straight
Right.
west the way it does now? Why?
Well, before about 1930, there really wasn't a direct route west of Franklin. It sort of wound around, and so there already was a road that was established to go north on Highland to Ontario. And so they were looking for an existing road that was in good shape that they could use. And so it just didn't exist. It was the only choice at the time. Plus, one of the main things that the route selectors looked at was going through cities, because they knew they could get support from businesses that would want to advertise. So they wanted to go through Ontario. Ontario Road's a very old road, yes. Other questions? Yes?
Jeff, it was really hard to see all those old Champlin buildings going down. I'm just wondering if you have some comments or perspective on that transition that's going on out of south of campus.
Yeah, I think it's indicative of how different our two different traditional commercial areas are. Our downtown is a traditional kind of downtown that we favor preservation and keeping things the way they were. Campus Town has always been, up to date, modern. Let's make things better, and so I think that it's reflective of community values. That there just wasn't a lot of value placed by the community on preservation in Campus Town, and part of it's because you know, it's a student area. It's dominated by student trade, and the students are here and gone, and so don't necessarily, even if they valued preservation, they don't have a mechanism to make it happen. I want to say this though. I know the Champlin family, and if there was a way to make a viable commercial use out of those buildings, they would have found it, because they tried everything to make those buildings pay. And in the end, they just couldn't figure out a way to make those buildings pay for themselves. And when they had the opportunity to sell all of it as a package, they had to seriously consider that. So there are still some of those buildings I showed you near the old bank in the 2500 block are still there, and still one-story and two-story commercial buildings. But I don't see any indication that the community really favors preservation for those buildings either. Other questions?
Well, thank you.
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm just amazed at the material and the information that you've provided here. What a tremendous amount of work you have done to present this program to us tonight. So thank you so much. Let's give him another round of applause.